I suppose we can start at this point if you want. Um, so why don't we start out with this? You are trying to more or less find out what your own view is, right? That's kind of the way you phrased it, right?
Well, yeah, I feel like I'm always investigating my own view is what it is. Like, so when I engage with people, I may come across sounding quite sure of myself, but really it's just me testing my own idea as much as anybody else.
Sure. So it sounds like you have a more you have your views, right? Like we all do,
Yeah,
but it sounds like you hold it kind of with an open hand. It's not like you're saying, "Er, this is the way it is," and that.
yeah, I'm very convinced about some things, but even that, like I said, it's I hold kind of open handed um,
Yeah,
because there's so much I don't know, and
right,
just
right. Well, let's.
really,
I don't mean to back up too much, but I just want to start off with what do we both agree on, right? So I think it's usually good to start off with what do you agree with, not only for the purpose of getting into the weeds of where we disagree, but just to lay the groundwork. Um, so, for example, just really, really basic. You believe that Jesus came in the flesh, that he died under Pontius Pilate. He was
yeah,
buried, crucified. He was crucified. He was buried. He rose again on the third day, and he is God. Right? You believe those things, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
basic Christianity.
Basic Christianity. Well, I just wanted, just so that we can start off by saying this is a dialogue of brothers in the faith. That it's not like we're going to be calling each other heretics or anything like that. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? So this is a
I don't.
friendly debate, an in-house debate. It's not like one of us is saying the other one isn't a Christian or anything like that. So,
Yeah.
um, well, I don't.
So
Go ahead.
the reason why I kind of encouraged us to do a space is because I was about to write a response to our discussion in private chat,
Uh huh.
and so I don't know if you want to start there or you had a
Sure. Well, okay. So my, I think my view of God. Kind of how I view God's sovereignty and things like that. I don't think that God is sitting there micromanaging everything that happens. Right? He's not.
yeah.
He's not like. I would disagree with people like R.C. Sproul and John Piper. As much as I love those men, I would disagree with them that they would say something like, "There's no rogue molecules," which in their mind would mean God is, sitting there controlling every molecule in the universe. That's not my view. However, you do know my view that God set up certain parameters, certain laws. We call these cosmological constants that
Hmm.
function that keep the universe more or less functioning as intended, right? So
Yeah.
part of this is a lot of times atheists will say, well, space is so big, so that means we're insignificant. But if you think about it, that doesn't tell us a whole lot, because what are all those things doing? They're basically just operating the way in a deterministic way, right? Like it's not like somebody's
Yeah.
sitting there making a choice on uh when the black hole is going to turn into a black hole. It's like that's not the way I see it. So
Yeah.
those
And
are
in that we're close, and in that we're very much closer. It's just going to be a more finer distinction than that
right, and
between
and the
us.
question is going to be, okay, so then we do have this thing we call Earth, and on this thing we call Earth, there are people, and we call them rational agents. Uh, we call humans rational creatures. Now, we can
Yeah.
debate about that topic. That might be even something we could debate as well, because I happen to believe that people are not inherently rational. because we are biased in all sorts of things all the time that basically things that dictate what our worldview is going to be. And that's where we are going to have a disagreement, because you would say, well, I choose what my uh, worldview is, right? That's a choice that I make to what I want to believe in, right? Is that right
Yeah,
so far? Yeah, yeah.
I think so.
So
I think we're kind of, yeah, I think that's kind of about, um, I think that's about where we start disagreeing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I would say our worldview, it's not like everything's super free flowing, like you can just choose whatever you want. There are certain presuppositions that people have that is going to dictate how they see the world, you know? And that's why there's words like schema. That's why there's words like worldview. That's why there's words like, uh, you know, uh, what's the word that I just used? Uh,
Ema?
not schema, but presuppositions, right? There's
Yeah.
presuppositions that we have. Now, these are why they're presuppositions is because they don't just change on a whim when we're feeling extra spunky or something like that, you know? It's like these are things that kind of guide our the way we see things. And
Right.
that I think that might be an interesting thing to talk about. So tell me how you would make sense of that. What do you think about that?
So, yeah, I would say that my question would be, like how, like, is trying to figure that out. Like, one of the things that comes up in these debates all the time is the "Who are you, old man?" That kind of catchphrase, and
Right.
that always rings differently to me in my head because I'm always thinking like, well, yeah, right. Who am I? Like, what are we? What are we talking about here? Whenever they're referencing you, like, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so like your presuppositions, your worldview, and things like that, and especially how that comes about. So again, back to my question would be, is your worldview something that's given to you or something you form, even if
Yeah.
you're doing it unconsciously? And I would
Right.
kind of move towards, you form it yourself.
Right. And
Like nobody.
I would say it's both. That's where I would say there is some element to, but it's kind of like the more you, it's like your worldview gets a little bit solidified over time. That's why people don't flip flop between certain positions all the time, because some people, and maybe that's not true of everyone, but it's a general trend that you have people that believe, well, what would be a good complementarianism versus egalitarianism, right? Like that's something that people or your favorite political party, right? That's a really good example. That people generally start from a base of I like Republicans or I like Democrats, and then it's kind of like they can even see evidence to the contrary of their favorite political party, and it doesn't necessarily change their mind, you know?
Yeah,
So there is some kind of feeding off of each other, reinforcement of certain things we believe. So,
but I think that no matter how deep you go, you end up on the self on that though. So like, you don't start. You're not born a Republican or a Democrat, for example. You're going to associate that maybe just emotionally as a child. You're like, oh, I'm surrounded by Democrats. They all love me, or I'm surrounded by Republicans. They all love me. And so it's just a pure emotional thing. And then you're invested in that. Like you said, you start developing presuppositions, and then those presuppositions have weight and force. But those are like, that's the part of the self. You've internalized that, right? Those presuppositions are internalized, and that's why they're so difficult to change.
sure, yeah, I mean that's we can change and people do change, but the question is how do people change? And that's where I
Right.
would say what starts that is the process of questioning our schema in the first place, right? We have to, for example, the example that I like to give is of Newton, right? Because Newton is a prominent figure in science, that everybody likes Newton in science. But at the time, his views were contested, and why they were, so he had to look at the universe and things like gravity in a different way than anyone had thought about it before. It's not like there was some other person like Newton that had similar views. He had to question the schema at the time. So we change our mind through I see it as two things happening at the same time. The first is we are questioning our schema at the particular time. We are actively questioning our presuppositions. The second thing would be this, what I call new information, which is like a novel thing that you are coming in through your senses or thinking about, that contradicts the worldview that you have built for yourself. So when you have those two things and you put them together, it's kind of like, well, then that allows the ability to say, I want to hang on to this new information that contradicts my schema, or I want to believe what I've always believed, or I want to reject what truth I'm coming across. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does make sense.
Okay, so that's kind of how I see it. How would you see it? How do people, go from Democrat to Republican or Republican to Democrat? How do you see that working?
That I would kind of agree with you on that as far as, but I guess I would just describe it as an internalization process. So you're considering new things or being impressed upon by new situations and the values you place on that. Like, so it's all internal. I mean, it's an internal processing of external events.
Right, right. And that gets it, that's really interesting, because I do think there's some merit to that idea, because in in the neuroscience literature, for example, they've shown that, well, they can make a person raise their hand, but they can't make a person will themselves to raise their hand, if that makes sense. Like there's
Yeah,
something going on in the volition of the person that they did it, but the danger of that, of course, is being me focused, and that's what I don't like, because then it gets into the question of, okay, what is God's role or function, or how does God relate to the universe? And there's different views about that, and I think you talked about in somewhat your view is, you at least the last time we talked, it was more of an open theist point of view, and that where the future is undetermined, so God doesn't know certain things.
yeah, in a nutshell.
Right. And I guess I would say, because we gave the example of, if of eating breakfast, right? That was the example that we gave. Now you can have a plan that you're going to eat breakfast tomorrow and you're going to have eggs and bacon, but you have, five different things you could eat for breakfast tomorrow. Now the question would be, you have a plan of what you're going to eat for breakfast. Does God know what that plan is? Maybe you didn't write it down, maybe it's all in your head. It's just internal to you, but you have a plan that you are going to eat eggs and bacon for breakfast tomorrow. So the question would be, does God know what that you're going to have eggs and bacon tomorrow, or at least be aware of that plan that you have to eat eggs and bacon tomorrow? Or is he, just going based off of, like a psychologist would, right? Like where he would say, well, let's see, he's like this type of person, and he usually makes these kind of decisions, so therefore he's probably going to do this. Like, is that like, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. So I guess I would say that what you're talking about, I think the two choices we have are is, is, is either A, God, well, I guess there'd be three choices. Sorry. But there's three choices. So the first is like determinism, like God knows it because he's causing it, right? The second one would be like a kind of wisdom, be out of God's wisdom, where he knows it, like you said, because he can reduce it, or he has all the facts and the answer is obvious, just like it would be for me or you. So I can know what you're going to eat for breakfast, uh, just because I have the facts at hand. Like you said, like a psychologist, knowing who you are, knowing what's available, knowing what's in your fridge, that kind of stuff. And then the third option would be that he knows it because he's there. So, like that would be he knows it because he's observing it happening in the future. So just like I would observe you eating cereal, and I know you're eating cereal, but God's in the future watching you eat cereal, and that's how He knows it throughout all time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that would be my view, right? Like, because I don't think that God is just like a smart human. I don't think he's just like a more capable being. I think he is the ground of everything else. So if and so I think your position would be something like God gave us the gift of free will, and so therefore because he gave us this ability to be able to choose, that means that there's some things that he's not going to be able to know because he gave us this ability, and he is wanting to respect that ability that he gave us. That's kind of how I see
I,
your position, but you can go ahead.
so I'm kind of torn. I think I'm kind of torn, but I'm not that far removed from holding the position that God was present in the future, and that's where sustains free will because just like I'm not interfering with your free will by watching you eat cereal, then if it's your free will choice in the future and God knows it because He's seeing it, that's not a conflict. That's not even a that's not an issue. So for me, the issue is more like, is the future real? Like, does it exist? And I see the future as defined as potentiality, which means it can only be known as in potential's language and potential framing.
Yeah, I understand your perspective, and I do think, and you can correct me if this is wrong or not, but my understanding is that this comes from certain cosmologists, certain physicists, certain things like that make assumptions about what the future is like in saying that the future is potential, because time, because we're not there yet, as kind of as you've talked about before, we're not there yet, so it can't be real, right? And
Yes.
so yeah, so that's why I would say, well, to God it has all happened already. And that's just my view, because you read in things like the Bible where it says, I created an ancient people from before they were an ancient people, and and he has this kind of, because God is other than anything we can conceive of. I mean, you just think about the Trinity. It's not like any other thing that is there, right? So it's not like God is like us, where he's processing the same sort of way that we are. He already knows. That's kind of, when it says, uh, from the foundation I've chosen Paul or something like that. I it's not just that he's figuring out that Paul would exist. He already knows that, because he already chose Paul before Paul existed, before, thousands of years before Paul existed. He already knows that what Paul would do.
And again, I guess so. I'm trying to order this stuff. So about the intellect thing, I don't see it as a problem. I mean, like I don't quite understand the objection to say, well, God's not just really smart, but He is really smart. Like you would agree with me that God is really smart, that He is, inconceivably smart, right?
Well, the way I would say it is that it's not even that God is an intelligent being. He is the ground of being. So it's not just that he is smart, it's that he is other than what our conception of what smart even means. So it's not that he is just has more of that same ability that we do. It's that he is other to our concept of what smart means.
Oh man, I see. To me, I just see like ideas just breaking. Like, so the idea of smart. Okay, so if God is other than smart, that language doesn't apply to him. Then when he says something like, "My thoughts are not your thoughts," that
Right.
makes no sense. He doesn't. I don't have. He would have to tell us, "I don't even have thoughts." It's one thing to say, "My thoughts aren't your thoughts. I'm distinct from you. I'm separate from you. I'm a different person than you, and we think differently, and we
Right.
have different priorities." But then to say, I don't even think, man. I don't even think. I just am. Like, there's no processing. There's no intelligence. It's just pure actuality.
Yeah, yeah, that's more or less how I see it because I think anytime you have a discussion or you are discussing something with an eternal being, that doesn't mean he can't make himself available in that time. I mean, just think of the incarnation, right? Like God became a man, but he's eternal. There's even a doctrine that says that even while Christ was on earth, he was still in heaven as well. So why? Because he's eternal. He's not like us. He's not like what I'm trying to say is that um, when God speaks to us, even in a very real, tangible way, it's not, it's like anthropomorphic language that we use to describe God because he's so other than us. It's kind of like, well, why wouldn't you say that the earth is flat? Because the Bible describes the earth is flat in the Psalms and things like that, and that's why you have flat earthers, right? Because the Bible makes it seem in because the Bible is not a science book, and in the same way, any portrayal of God is an imperfect way to describe God. That's the way I
The
would.
flatter, the flatter stuff is a CIA psyop. That's all that is.
Well, it's certainly not rational. That's what I would say. So we have rockets going into space, and you can see that the Earth is a
I don't want to go
sphere.
there. I don't want to go there. I
Yeah.
don't want to go there.
Uh, uh,
But the thing is that as soon as you make it to where everything about God is like God is totally other. He doesn't. We can't speak of him as thinking because he doesn't have thoughts, and we can't speak of him rising or ascending or descending from heaven because he's everywhere all at once. He's in the flesh and in the spirit, in heaven on the throne forever. Um, I think that you just kind of make it to where the Bible's unintelligible. I can't understand I don't understand what it means to like for God to say he's repented of something. Like doesn't make any sense. Or to say, God's thought has thoughts that are not like ours. And like, well, that doesn't make sense because he doesn't have thoughts. Like it just falsifies all the concepts that are appealed to in the Bible. But my biggest objection is that the Bible could have really easily just said that type of stuff. Like, like instead of being anthropomorphic, it could be quite literal and say, I don't, you know, I don't have thoughts. I don't.
right, and I understand that objection, right? I get it because but at root, it's about how literal do you want to read the words about God. And there are places that say that God is, totally above us and not comparable to us whatsoever. There are verses that say that. So,
I have a question. Let me have I have a projection question for you.
okay.
If I was going to start off with a principle, You have to pick one of these principles. I'm going to start off with you have to start off with these principles as one of your foundations, right? You either A, read the entire Bible as figurative until proven that it's literal, or B, read it as literal until it's proven as figurative. Which one should we choose?
I mean, I honestly can't give an answer to that. And the reason I can't is because it depends on the genre of the book or the story or the passage of the Bible that we're considering.
Well,
Because some things
but
are clear.
you're laying down the foundation for saying God is other, so everything is inherently going to be about God. Is going to be an anthropomorphic. So that means we have to start off with the foundation of it's anthropomorphic until proven otherwise. So when it's talking about God, it's anthropomorphic until you have a really good reason to think it's literal. And when it's, of course, man, talking about man's not anthropomorphic. You have a good reason to think it's literal, but you've laid the foundation for an anthropomorphic reading of all things first and foremost. And that to me is unfalsifiable. Like I wouldn't even know how to object to that.
Well, yeah, that's because it's theology, it's not science. It the Bible does not answer science questions. It's not like you can, for example, I've shared miracles that I've experienced, and I share them with an atheist. And when my evidence is good, they say, well, this isn't peer reviewed, so I can't trust it. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Oh yeah,
So
I love
it, it's
it's
kind of the
silly.
same sort of thing when you're discussing theology, because God is not a thing that you can put in a test tube and say, well, if I do this to the experiment, then I know God is real, and if I do that to an experiment, I know God is fake. It doesn't work like that. So all I'm trying to say is that um, it does make sense to consider, if God, just consider this, if God was a completely other uh, being that is unlike any other being, how would God communicate to us? And I think it would still fit if you read these passages that talk about, and the Lord said to Abraham, or, the God visited Job and said, were you there when I laid the foundations of the world? Like, yes, it's really God coming into a specific part of time, but the question is whether or not God would have always done that because he's eternal.
If you ask like how God is going to communicate, that to me that's okay. So I would suggest that a God that is totally other could not possibly communicate to people other than divine um, revelation or gnosis, because communication requires a commonality. Like something has to be true between us for us to communicate. We both have to know the rules of the game to play it.
Okay, I think what I would say is, if God is big, I hate to say it this way, but if God is bigger than anything in the universe, and I mean that in an ontological sense, right? Not just a size sense. Obviously, you understand that. But I'm
Yeah.
saying, if God is bigger in an ontological sense, there's nothing that says that he can't come into the granular and speak to us that way just because he's bigger. It's kind of like if if a parent, right, if a parent sees his child and he wants to encourage his child, and his child's in a baseball game, uh, the 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 parent can yell from the sidelines, "Way to go, Jimmy! You're doing great!" Right? Even though
Hmm.
that he is technically he's not participating in the game, in the baseball game, right? He's on the sidelines, but he's still playing an active role in his child's life from the sidelines. So just because that God is bigger than us doesn't mean he can't interject himself temporally in this existence. Does that make sense?
I say yes and no. Um, yes, it does make sense. Let me give you a an illustration story. Have you heard about you've heard the example of the 3D person speaking to the 2D person?
I have not heard that. Why don't you tell me?
Okay, so the idea is that you have a two-dimensional person. He's a circle, right? Or a square or a triangle, whatever, any two-dimensional shape. So imagine him existing on a sheet of paper, right? And three-dimensional person is looking at two-dimensional person. He can see everything. Two-dimensional person is walking around, and the illustration is really not of persons, but of God. God is a three-dimensional person, and so God says, okay, I'm gonna reveal myself to the 2D people. And so he takes his finger and he sticks it into 2D world. And he says, well, what do the people see? What do two-dimensional people see? He stuck his finger in the in the uh, in the 2D world. Well, he sees a circle. And so God's revealed himself to one 2D person, and he goes tell the other one, I've seen God. I've seen God. He's a circle, right? And then God says, well, I'm going to reveal myself to somebody else, and he sticks three fingers into the two-dimensional space. And what does that person see? Well, he sees three circles. And so that person goes off and says, no, I've seen God. He's three circles. So does that make sense to you,
Yeah, it makes
Paul?
perfect sense. And I think that's literally how God reveals himself to us. Like
Right,
it, and so I wouldn't have a problem with that kind of language at all to describe how God communicates to us, because he might, reveal himself as a burning bush to Moses, which
right.
represents all three members of the Trinity all at once. But then he might also appear as the angel of the Lord to Joshua, which is a
So
different way that God reveals himself to his creation. Does that make sense? Or it could
yeah,
be
so
even in a
the
science
reason why I shared
experiment.
that,
Go ahead.
the reason why I shared that is because I think it represents what you're saying as far as God being so big. And it also kind of makes the point that I'm trying to make as far as like it takes a commonality. Like God has to enter 2D space. But the thing is that there's no room for anthropomorphisms in that.
Well, sure there
If
is,
that makes
because God is 3D, and he's bringing himself into 2D so that that person does not actually see what God is like in reality. He only sees him in 2D language. He doesn't see him in his full
well,
3D.
that's true. And that's not true. That's true, and that's not true because he does see God as he is on the like in the two-dimensional access. In other words, it's not what they're seeing is not false. The greater truth is not falsified by the interaction, and that's the essential part. Is that you can't have a situation where what's revealed is then falsified on a larger. God reveals Himself, and that becomes false in a larger sense.
Right, and I would agree with that, because without that, it's kind of like, well, how can you know anything about God? But
That's a good question.
I do think that the integrity of God needs to be maintained. It's kind of like all I'm getting at is the creature creator distinction, that
Yeah,
if
but
if you think about it, how can something that literally created a being, like we can't even understand ourselves to the completely, it's like scientists are all the time trying to figure out neuroscience and all this sort of thing. We can't even understand ourselves. How are we going to understand something that is created us?
well, I think that you hit the nail on the head when you say how can we know anything about God? And my argument is that it's through it's either have it through divine revelation, gnosis, or through communication. But I think he set it up to where he can communicate. I think that's I think that's a viable option. We're not just limited to to Revelation, uh, and that implies that we are like Him enough to communicate, almost like we were in His image. Like it's not, we can't possibly be totally other than, like God can't possibly be totally other than us because we are in His image. And if He was totally other than us, then we wouldn't even be in His image. We couldn't be.
Well, see, that's just where I would go back to saying just because God is bigger than us doesn't mean he can't make himself real in the 2D. You know, it's kind of like, and I wouldn't even say that it would be like 2D to 3D. I would say it would be more like 2D to
Yeah.
4D. I would say God is so
The oversimplified
much
example.
grander than us that thinking about what created you, you know, people are thinking all the time how to figure out the Trinity because it's not
Hmm.
anything like anything else that we know of, but it's not a contradiction either. You know, so I don't see it as uh, if God has to have the same, you know, qualities as us to communicate with us, because it's kind of like it's kind of here's another example. It would be kind of like a mind is sophisticated as a human compared to a bacteria, right? Like, and obviously the analogy breaks down at a lot of parts, but the point being that that bacteria, it's just an instinctual thing that that bacteria is doing. We have these much grander motivations than a bacteria, but that's kind of how I would describe it. Is it would be let's say this. It's more like a wizard, right? Okay, so I have a pet wizard. Let's say I have a pet wizard, and that
Wizard.
pet wizard. What's that?
I thought you said wizard.
Oh, no, wizard, lizard. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So it's kind of like that lizard does not have the same kind of cognitive thoughts that I do. It just functions on a totally different way. And yet my motivations as a human is so much more advanced than that lizard because I am, for example, I'm caring for the lizard. I'm giving it mice, or I'm giving it beetles, or I'm giving it, you know, cockroach, like whatever the case is. I'm sustaining that lizard, even though the lizard cannot comprehend what I'm doing for it. It's not like it's going, oh yeah, my master or whatever is taking care of me. Like that's not the way a lizard would actually think about the situation. They would just go, "Oh, that cricket looks really good. I think I want to eat it." Like it's not even that advanced. Do you know what I mean?
Problem. I guess this is the problem. I would say is that I get what you're saying. Like I get like the point of like we're not God, right? And God is not. And Jesus kind of makes it hard to say he's never been man. He's not man. Uh, but God is other than us. Not my point is that we can't stray so far into sort of like worm theology that we destroy the idea that we're in the image of God. That means something, and it has implications. And to me, that's the basis on how God relates to us. And so much of how we understand God and how God reveals Himself to us that it can't be thrown out.
Well, I would just say, you know, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? This is something that's been debated for a long, long time. And there are a lot of different answers on what that means. And so that's where I would just say, okay, we're looking at one passage of scripture to then say a kind of comprehensive way we're viewing humanity and God. And I don't know if that would be prudent to psychoanalyze one passage of scripture that's just used. I mean, there might be references to it elsewhere in the Bible, but all I'm trying to say is that that is a topic that has been debated for a long time, and it's not like there's a clear answer as to what that means. Does that make sense?
And I'm not trying to uh, I'm not trying to answer that so much as put it on the spectrum. So if on one end you have God, he's way on the he's way all the way to the right, you know, on the scale, and then on infinitely on the other end is bacteria. You know, we're not that far over. We're further to the right than we are the middle, the left. You know, and that difference, wherever they put that slider, is the basis for our relation to God, how we relate to God, understand God.
Yeah, and to me, I would just say there's a gap, right?
No, there's
I would,
yeah, I agree. I agree.
yeah, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I'm saying that the line stops and there's a gap. There's not a continuous line from us to God like there would be from bacteria
This
to us.
is a scale. It's not a yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to say talk about it the way I understand it is I would say God is in a category all by himself. That's all I'm trying to say. I wouldn't use the association like there's a continuous line that is undivided, and then you have God at the end. I would just see
The
God as wholly other from the line where we would measure everything else.
the problem is that God is not really quite totally other in that he has connections to us directly through Christ.
Yeah, I mean, and I know people that the incarnation itself has been a stumbling block for people to being part of the reason that they gave up their faith in the first place. Because
Really.
yes, how can God be a man? I mean, that's why Paul says this is foolishness to the world. This is foolishness to the Greeks. How God can become a man. That, that's why there is something transcendent about the very nature of God because yes, it is true that God, how can God be a human? Well, if you really analyze it, it's not something we're going to be able to, at the end of the day, say, I know how it works. This is how it works. Like, that's not,
So
that's, go ahead.
this I would say is that if uh if we want to have a discussion about God, right, we have to speak in some area of agreement of how we are the same, how we are similar to God, the areas that we have in common with God. What do we have in common? And if it's absolutely nothing, then we can't relate. There's no relate. There's no relate. We can't relate to that. He might be able to relate to us because he's infinite and he, well, you know, whatever. But we can't relate to him at all because we
Yeah.
can't conceive of. We can't even conceive of him. Everything we know is wrong, and anything we say about him is just a falsehood as as separate from him as he is other from us.
Yeah, and that's why it goes back to the incarnation, how God took on flesh. That's how he relates to us. And trying to understand the mystery of how God can become a man, that's not anything that we have the capacity to really understand, you know.
I've never
But
ever had to. I've never
and yet
that.
and yet
That may be a
Christ is
historical
always,
issue.
go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I just was saying like that might have been a historical. That may have been a historical hangup. I've never had that hangup. I don't quite understand it honestly. So
Yeah, that's why I would say, the incarnation itself is a hard thing to think about. However, if we understand that the second person of the Trinity always existed from eternity past, then that's a perfect example of how God, infinite, holy, eternal God, can come into this world to relate to his creation. That he actually ate bread and he actually, had to bathe and he actually went to the bathroom. I mean,
And I would say that may help him relate to us, but that doesn't help us relate to him.
it's interesting that you say that because it it doesn't have to be um, that we must be able to understand God. I think we relate to God in the way that he reveals himself to us. And so, in that way, you're right. It is kind of a one way path. I was watching, I think it was Gavin Ortland. He did a video on this one time, and I can't remember how he addressed this concern. I really wish I could remember what he said, but he basically raises up the exact same thing that you're talking about, and how
Yeah.
in classical theism, how is it that God can interact with his creation? And he gave a really good answer. I just wish I could remember what it
Yeah.
was. Unfortunately, I can't remember.
Yeah. I think, yeah, it just doesn't, it'd be like the 2D person reaching up to the 3D, the 5D world, whatever. Like it doesn't go that way. So I just don't, and again, I think that revealing, like I'm not going to cut out revealing, God revealing himself to people. That's gnosis. That's a gnosis kind of point of view. He can do that. That's fine. But that's not relational. And so, and on my position, on my view, we're relational with God. We have relations with him and relationship with him. And that's what you're talking about. Your view just precludes that or makes it to me nonsense. Like I can't make sense of a relationship in that
Right.
context.
And I
That's my
would
that's
just
my
say,
hang up.
I would just say God cares about his creation. He cares about what he created. And he does reveal himself to us in very personal ways sometimes, like I've had
No, we
instances.
wouldn't know what that means. No,
Huh?
won't even know. Like that's all anthropomorphic language. We don't even know what caring means or how that relates to us, or you know, uh, you get into some of these other complex issues where you know, God's creating people to go to hell or something like that. That person is never going to feel like he's in a relationship. Like that relationship sucks. Uh,
Right.
so
Yeah, and that's where I try to maintain a biblical point of view, because I do think the Bible shows in some instances, for example, with Israel and the Assyrians, it's kind of like God sends the Assyrians to punish the Israelites, and then God, by his wisdom, he says, "You guys who I forced to punish the Israelites, I'm going to punish you through another nation."
yeah, I mean, I don't think um, I don't think it's really like you're laying a groundwork to read all that onto. Like the foundation we have been talking about is what that scripture is read through, and like once like I'm rejecting the foundation. Those concepts. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, it's not so much reading it through a certain paradigm, it's more seeing what happened and what does God say about it. I
But
mean,
God is already other. So
right, that doesn't
like
mean he can't communicate. Like, we both agree that God can communicate to us, right?
no, we do not. I mean, on my view, he can communicate. On your view, I say he can't. There is no such thing as communication between them. There's only divine revelation and gnosis. Because again,
I would not
well,
consider it, I would not consider it gnosis. I would not use that terminology. I
I mean,
I think our understanding is flawed in many ways. I've had experiences where I've thought, that something was directly from God, and it turns out that maybe my conception of what happened wasn't exactly God, but it still led me on a good path. So even though I felt like I had a certain revelation given to me, I still realized, well, I might have to think about this, but it got me on a good track to where I am now. So I wouldn't say any experience that a person has is infallible, which is what gnosis means. I wouldn't say, I've had experiences where I've audibly heard a voice, right? And so that's where I'm coming from is I know God communicates to us, but yet I still respect and admire and revere the providence of God. I still see him as, and it's because of my revelation I've had that I see God as big and grand and not like us. Does that make sense? Like it's not because of the revelation I've gotten. It's because of that I see God the way I do.
Right. And so, I mean, I'm certainly not rejecting that God is bigger than us, right? Um, I would just reject that that we don't have any commonality with him. And you know,
Well, the
that's to me the
commonality that
main,
I would say that we have is God is a mind, or God has a mind, and we have a mind. That's where I would say we are both the same. In the
I don't
sense
think
that
you can say that. I don't think you can say that consistent with your position.
why not?
Like if I held your position that God was totally other, I wouldn't be able to say that because any idea that you have of mind doesn't really apply to God.
Not in the same way it applies to a human, but the general concept would still hold true for God.
Not at all. Not at all. Not everything we understand about a mind, everything you experience about a mind, every concept you have of a mind would objectively not apply to God.
Well, it would, just in a bigger way. I mean, yeah, you could
No,
say
not
I'm using anthropomorphic language to describe God. That's fine. But I would still want to maintain that God is other rather than reducing him to a smart human, you know?
but see, what's the point of them if you reject? Okay, saying a smart human, I don't think that I don't think that's really clarifying language. I'm not saying he's a smart human. I'm saying he's intelligent. Like God is intelligent, that he has a mind. I would say that on my side, but and we can understand what those are because we understand what mind and intelligence is. But your position is that he's other than that, that our concepts don't really apply to him, that it's only anthropomorphic at best. Unless, of course, and again, I know you want to, I know you deny, I know you want to reject the language of gnosis, and I'm not trying to force it on you. I'm just kind of pointing out that that is only the only avenues available to that kind of being.
Well, that's why we have the Bible we have today, is because God did reveal certain things to certain people and they wrote it in a book, and the book is
But
what we have today.
that's not the same. No, that's not how communicate. That's not how that would work. Because once you have it written down, you're talking about the realm of communication. You can't communicate. That's like when people go to heaven and they come back and they say, "Well, what was it like?" And they're like, "I don't know. I can't tell you. Like it's nothing. It's nothing like on earth. I can't even explain it. There's no words." Like that's revelation. That's gnosis. That would be an example of that. So once it's written down and you're explaining it, you're appealing to commonality. That's relational, and
Where
that's what
did
you reject
well
when you say that.
Isaiah wrote about seeing basically Jesus pre-incarnate come from the temple. He saw him in the temple, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know why it would be it's I don't know why there would be a communication barrier, like all of a sudden the person can't communicate what it is that they experienced.
because that would be, again, that's like the 2D, 3D thing. Like whatever they experience, it's not actually, it becomes falsified by the greater context.
Well, it doesn't get falsified by the greater context. It's just that we live at a lower resolution than God does. God lives at an infinite resolution, and we live on it's kind of
It's
like
not, I don't think that's, is, okay. So we're talking about intelligence, right? So a guy comes down and he communicates, he speaks with somebody and he tells them stuff. This is true about whatever. Uh, and then to do that, he has to, it's an anthropomorphic exam. It's all anthropomorphic. It's all condescension. It's not actually, whatever he presents is actually not like himself. It's just a,
it's an imperfect picture.
yeah. And I think I would object to that. Like, I would object to that.
Okay,
Like,
so
because I think,
let's consider this. Why do some people get more revelation of God than others? Because from your point of view, it's kind of like, well, God is a relational being, so he relates to us. But then why do some people experience a greater knowledge or a greater revealing of who God is than other people? Because if God is just a personal being to every single person, then
mhm,
we would all get the same amount of revelation of God, but we don't.
I don't think that follows at all. I don't think it follows that we'd all have the same. Uh, I, I don't think that follows at all. We'd have to be all born in the same person.
We'd have to all be born the same person.
We would all have to be the same person to get exactly the same thing.
Okay, so you think God's relationship with us is based on what the kind of person we are? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying relationships are inherently uh, two directional, interdirectional relationships. I mean, like you and I can both be related to our brother, right? But we can't have the same relationship with our brother because we're two different sets of, it's two different relationships.
Okay, sure.
So anyway, I guess we kind of get in a little far field. You can ask me whatever you want. I don't want to cut you off or anything.
No, no, no. You're fine. I think I've talked way more than you have, so it's totally fine.
This is, let me kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about one of the topics that kind of came up and one of my other objections. So when I'm listening to you talk, the feedback I'm trying to give you or the is like why I can't accept what you're saying or what I would have to believe if you know what I'm saying. I'm trying to accept what you're saying and trying to project myself onto that belief. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
So
just to address that real quick, you have to think about, would you want God, what kind of God do you want? Do you want a God that is holy and other from anything else, that his glory is infinite, his knowledge and his power and his everything is completely better than anything we can conceive of? Do you want that God, or do you want a God that uh, you know relates to us in a personal way such that he is limited? And that's what I think the brass tacks is.
want a God that's limited.
Yeah, I would say you have a more limited God than I do. I mean, that just seems obvious to me. Because if God has to, in the way that you're talking about how he relates to us, it means he's not able to do whatever he wants. And that's why I say, Job said, I have, heard you by the ear, and now I see you face to face. And I know that whatever purpose you plan cannot be thwarted. I mean, to me, that just seems like clear language to me. Are you there? Are you there?
I'm here. I am
Okay.
here.
Okay.
Hello.
Yep, yep, yep. Did you drop
I'm gonna
off or
talk.
something?
I don't know. One of us did. Let me
Okay.
try that again. I'm gonna try that answer again.
Go ahead.
So, oh man, I forgot. I was halfway through. I think that once you talk about what God wants, like God can do whatever He wants, that sort of begs the question as to what He wants. Because if He creates relational beings and whatever limitations that applies to that, that's of His doing, not mine. That's not a limitation that I'm imposing. That's a limitation He's created. And He can, if He wants to limit Himself, like just talking about Him being other and coming down is a limitation of Himself. So I don't see a problem like on either view of why that would be a valid objection.
Okay, so what you're saying is, and this gets into the discussion that I tried to say, is that we can't understand the incarnation. It's impossible for us to understand how that works.
I
But
don't. I don't. I mean, I don't. I don't know why that would be the case. Like, if God's a person and we're persons as well, like I don't see the problem with Him putting on flesh. I don't see how that becomes
right,
problematic.
and the thing is that Jesus isn't just a person. He's the creator of the
No, but
person.
He is. This is not about the differences. This is about the similarities. We're not a create. We're not. We are creators as well. We're not the creator, but we are creators. We are creative. So we understand what that even means. Like
So
we can't. Like we understand. Yeah, I don't want to go over that again.
I wanted to go because it sounded like we were getting into a little bit different discussion there. A little while back when you tried to talk about something else. What was that again? Like, could you tease that out?
This is what I was trying to go. This is the direction I was trying to go. Slightly different. So this has to do about the future, right? We talked about the three options. I don't know how much you agree with those options, if that's exhaustive. I'm not claiming that to be the end all, but that's how I get it, how I understand it. And so the idea of God being in the future and observing us in the future, right? The problem I have with that is that places us as actually existing in the future. Like that makes the future real. God's real. If He's in the future's real. If He's watching us do something, that is real. And that makes us really existent beings in the future. Like we become multi-dimensional beings, at least on the time point,
Can I ask why?
because God's seeing it. It's real. He's there. It's not a projection. It's not a projection in His mind through His wisdom. It is a presence. He is present in the future, like He is present right now, and He's observing you in the future, just like He's observing you right now. That's a timeless view. So that makes it all equally real, which means that you are real. And if you're real in both past, present, and future equally, that makes you a multi dimensional being.
Why?
That's it, because you exist in all the dimensions. Like that's like asking. It's kind of like asking why we're three dimensional. Like we are because we have those dimensions. So if you exist in the future, like do you exist in the future? If God's watching you, do you exist in the future?
I think I will exist for as long as God wants me to exist.
Right. But in the times that you do exist, so from now until you die, like 10 years from now, suppose you're alive 10 years from now, and God knows what you're doing because He's observing you doing it in the future. How is that not real?
Well, I honestly don't know what I think about that. And It's honestly an unexplored, and maybe this is a blind spot on my part, but I
Oh, well, that's
I
actually I appreciate
yeah, well, I don't know that I've thought about whether or not God exists in the future or not. I don't know what I think. I think he can view anything in the future, and I don't think that it is him looking down the corridors of time to figure out what is going to happen. I think he sees the past, present, and future all at the same time, while also being able to, watch the race, the beginning of the race itself, and the end of the race all at the same time. That's how I view God. But maybe that would mean that God actually exists in the future. I don't know. I haven't actually thought about
so
that so
the,
much.
that's good. That's so the quarters of time view is that God is fixed in the time now.
Are you there? It sounds like you dropped off.
Hold on a second. Hello, hello.
Yep, yep, gotcha.
Huh? Yeah, I'm walking around outside my house though. I get
Okay,
nervous and I walk.
sure.
I've been walking about 10 miles so far.
Wow.
Not really. I just nervous walk.
Sure.
Um, no, so I guess it goes back to the three. You'd have to formulate a different version of knowing the future. So corridors of time, like that to me is uh, that to me is a presence argument that he's present in the future because you know the idea of a corridor is like looking down a hallway, so you're still there. Like it's still in your view just as much as what is in the front. Like it doesn't matter what part of the hallway you're seeing the whole thing. It's all real. It has to all be real. You can't see that's not real, right?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, that even in the case that God does look through the corridors of time and he looks in advance at what is going to happen, you're still saying that that would make the future an actual thing.
Yes.
Yeah,
If
and,
it's not
and
based
from
on wisdom, if it's not wisdom based, because wisdom is like you and I looking and saying, well, that meteor's headed towards us. I think I can figure out what's going to happen.
right. And I guess at that point I would just bite the bullet and say, yeah, I guess in some sense the future is real in some way.
And that's fine. That's fine. I was there. That's where I like, if I'm going to back up on something, that's what it's going to be. Um, but the implication then is that you are real in the future.
Well, I don't
And
know why it would necessitate that. Like, why is that necessary that for me to exist in the future?
because he's observing you in the real future. Once you say the future is real and God is there and he knows what you're doing in the future because he's watching you do it in the future, he's watching you. That's the key part. The key phrase is he is watching you. That means you were there. That's implied. That's necessary to the the, the idea. Like, what are we saying if it's not? He's watching nothing.
Right. And I guess let me ask this question.
Mm-hmm.
When we both believe in the Big Bang, right? You believe in the Big Bang?
Not evolutionary. No,
Okay, so are you a 6 day creationist?
tend to be
Okay, so then this is not going to really work too well, because that actually makes a lot of sense from your point of view, because I was going to ask, if the Big Bang is true and the universe is trillions of years old, then it would mean that at some point God had to make life on Earth. By the way, I reject macro evolution as well. I just do not deny the age of the universe, if that makes sense. I don't believe in abiogenesis, for example. I reject that.
that's
But
well. I think that. there's no reason for an old Earth except for evolutionary mindset. That's what would necessitate that view. Other than that, we have no clue.
Well, I wouldn't say that because if you look at the science of how we know that the Big Bang caused the universe, it's things that are removed specifically from evolution. Because, for example, the redshift in the speed of light, that things are expanding away from us. So if you look at the radiation, things that are further away from us have a slower shift than things that are closer to us. I mean,
Yeah.
and yeah, so I don't I don't accept macroevolution, but I do think that based on the science, and I think it's compatible with what we read in the Bible as well, because if you want to take the Bible literally in things like, that God created the earth in 6 days, well, then there's also other passages in Scripture that talk about what the earth is like, and I'm not sure you would agree with the way the earth is depicted in the Bible.
I would I would say this that uh, as far as the science goes, I think it is. Um, I think it's fairly weak. And what I mean weak is that there are other explanations. Not like we have only one theory available to us. So, so it's not like a foregone conclusion that we have the age of the universe. And then also there's all the complications to it as well, which is like as soon as you ask scientifically, how old is something? Whenever you ask what time is it, you have to say the next question is where.
Sure.
So it's to me as a layperson, um, it's just a big kind of question mark that they guess at and act much more sure of than they have any right to be. And so that
Right.
makes it weak. That makes it just a weak, you know.
Yeah, I think the overall consensus, cosmologically speaking, cosmological scientists, is more or less that the universe began to exist. And I think on that much you would agree with me. The question
Sure.
is, when did
Yeah.
it begin?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would just look at things like galaxies that are moving away from us at a very fast speed that kind of show, okay, so we know about, I mean, obviously we don't know exactly, but it kind of shows evidentially that the universe is, our best guess is such and such years old, you know,
Yeah.
based on what we see from the cosmic shift of radiation and things like that. But I mean, I honestly, I get what you're saying, that if it's an argument based on the Bible, I would understand that if you honestly think that the Bible says that the earth was created in 6 days and there's no other way to read that, then I can understand why you would hold that position, right? I just don't think that it's necessary for the earth to be created in 6 literal days.
Oh, I know what my problem is.
What's that?
I'm sorry. I have my phone on Wi-Fi, and so every time I walk out of it, it cuts off.
Oh, I see.
So sorry.
That's okay.
I, the age thing, I would say that I don't see it as a salvific issue. I have my opinion on it, but it's really I'm almost not disinterested in it because I have a fairly strong opinion on it. But it's not a point I'd fight too much over. I mean, I'll voice my kind of concerns about it, but at the end of the day, like I could grant that. Like I could grant it. That'd be okay.
Yeah. And I appreciate that perspective because I do think there's a lot of people out there that are quick to say, well, if you don't believe that the earth is literally 6,000 years old, then you're a heretic. There are people
Yo,
like that. And
yeah,
so I appreciate that you're not like that, you know?
yeah. I mean, if we're wrong, I'm wrong about all kind of stuff in the Bible. So just got to figure it out. Just got to figure out where that is and hope. And
Yeah.
everybody who disagrees, knows the truth part is going to call me a heretic on that. Some of the stuff I'm wrong about.
Right.
That's kind of life.
Yeah.
But again, I get at least.
Whoop. Lost you.
There you go. There you go.
All
Anyway,
right.
so that's it. Oh, let's see. Oh man, my phone's crazy. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh man, my phone is just driving me nuts. What happened? Did my mic die? Okay. Anyway, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So,
Okay.
where do you wanna end up in this conversation? Where would you like to kind of end the conversation? What would you like to come away with? Maybe we can focus on agreement again, of where do we agree on things, you know?
That sounds too boring, man. You got to leave it on wanting more.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Got to have the next of the seats for. Um, I guess for disagreement, not really disagreement, but for an area of
Okay, you're really quiet. I don't know why.
the view of the future being real, that means and how that
You're very quiet. You're very quiet. I can't hear you very well.
time aspect of how old it is and things like that. I think we're, I don't know if we can say agreement, full agreement, but
Can you hear me, Mindtrap? Mindtrap, you're talking, but you're very quiet. I can't understand what you're saying because you're so quiet.
oh gosh, well, I think oh my phone is just killing me on here. All right,
Okay.
sorry. Can you hear me now?
So go ahead. Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead. Start from the beginning of what you were talking about.
Okay, so I guess I'm really interested in seeing how you how you progress on or what your future thoughts are on the future existing and what it being a reality that exists and you existing in the future and what that means or implies. Um, because I think that's one of the areas where that's what keeps me from holding your view.
Right.
That's the thing that keeps me from holding your view. Because again, I did believe that the future was real and that was we could have free will in that sense because that's just the decisions we were making in the future. Um, and that was my version of compatibilism, I guess.
Okay.
But um,
Well,
anyway, I guess
I don't know. I would just say that there is a difference between what is actual and what is in the future. So the present certainly exists. That's actually the nuts and bolts of what actually does exist is the present. And I would say because I hold the view that God is an other from his creation, that he's not limited in the same way we are to where he has to that we're actualized in the future. I don't know if that is making sense or not, but that's kind of the way I would say it is. Even though we are not physically in the future, God can still see. It's a question of how do you parse out God's foreknowledge and his uh, omnipotence, you know? And I think
mm-hmm.
God's foreknowledge is different from his omnipotence. And I think this is really a thing that Calvinists, for example, really conflate. They conflate those two things. They say his foreknowledge is his omnipotence. And I just see it as a categorical difference because um, I can I can I can watch a baseball game that happened in the past, and maybe I've seen that baseball game before, so I know who's going to win. But watching the baseball game, those things are still playing out. So even though I don't necessarily control who is going to win the baseball game, if I'm watching the baseball game that happened in the past, I still know the outcome of of who won the baseball game, and that is just the way I would see how God knows the future. Is that whether or not God quote unquote looks through the corridor of time to see what happens, that's a question I need to think more about, and maybe I need to do some reading on that. But I will say that uh, for example, where God says, "Who is like me that can announce the future?" I just take that at face value and say, well, if God says that He knows the future, I would just take Him at His word.
Well, but we wouldn't. That would fall into the category of wisdom, knowing the future because of wisdom. That would be valid. That's not validated there. And the question I guess I would still have would be is can God see things that aren't real?
Well, it would depend on if those things ever actually happened or not.
That
Because if something actually happens, like let's say in your view, you would say certain things are undefined. But
Yeah.
if those things actually happen, then it means that there's a gap between what actually happens and what God has knowledge about. Does that make sense? So it would be rogue instances of things that actually happened that is like kind of like uh, impossible for God to know, even though they do actually happen in reality.
Right, but that just means they're defined when they're defined. That's all that would mean. Like that's kind of like trying to nail down exactly what moment the present is. And while we can debate that, I don't think that quite is the essence of the problem.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah, yeah.
mean,
That's all right. Hey, look,
I
man,
think
I appreciate
I
you. You
yeah,
really
I
have helped me
appreciate you
today.
too. Huh?
You really have helped me out a little bit today. Kind of speaking a little more. I don't know if I'll be able to listen to myself on rewind, but I certainly appreciate your time.
Yeah, and thanks for coming on and doing this. And it was a good discussion. I think I felt like I didn't do as good as I did on the space with Adam, but we still talked, and it was still cordial, and nobody was yelling at each other, that sort of thing. So overall, even though I'm not really thrilled with how I did, I still
Oh
consider it a success.
no, this is good. This is good. So no pressure, no hype.
Yeah.
I'm not like I said. I'm trying to. I don't know how much I believe I can convince anybody. So
Right. And that's the same for me too. I learned that some time ago that convincing someone of something is dang near impossible.
what's that saying? Evidence is what it takes to convince a reasonable mind, and proof is what it takes to convince an unreasonable mind.
Sure, that makes sense. But still, some people deny proof too.
Yeah. Well, they're not reasonable though. Well, no,
Right. Yeah.
unreasonable mind. Yeah. Anyway,
Well, all right, bro. It was good. Maybe we can do this again sometime.
anytime, man.
But appreciate your time, and we'll talk again sometime. All right.
Thank you, man. You have a blessed day.
Yeah, you too. Talk to you later.
All right, bye.
Bye.